Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, November 12th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, the U.S. bombs Iran-aligned targets in Syria. So the U.S. military announced on Monday that it launched multiple strikes against Iranian-aligned targets in Syria, referring to Shia militias that are allied with Iran. U.S. Central Command claimed in a press release that the strikes were launched in retaliation for attacks on its personnel in the region, although there has been no recent reports of any attacks that have damaged U.S. bases or harmed U.S. troops. And I mean, just in the last few days, in the last few weeks, I haven't seen anything like that. Central Command said in a press release, quote, "Today, U.S. CENTCOM forces conducted strikes against 9 targets in 2 locations associated with Iranian groups in Syria in response to several attacks on U.S. personnel in Syria over the last 24 hours, end quote. So the UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reported that 4 members of Iran-aligned Shia militias were killed and 9 were wounded by airstrikes launched by the International Coalition, and that's a reference to the U.S.-led coalition in Iraq and Syria. So these figures are not confirmed. The observatory, again, it's based in the UK. Sometimes they're the only ones offering casualty figures. Sometimes their numbers kind of change pretty dramatically, or they're not exactly right, but sometimes they are correct. So they're saying at least 4 killed in these strikes, and that's the only source that I've seen so far offering a number. And the strikes were reported in 2 areas of eastern Syria's Deir ez-Zor province. The U.S. has about 900 troops in Syria. It's an illegal military occupation. The U.S. also backs the Kurdish-led SDF in the area, which gives the U.S. Control of a pretty significant portion of Syria's territory. So these U.S. airstrikes come amid very high tensions in the region. There's all this anticipation about Iran responding to the Israeli airstrikes on its territory. And Iranian officials are saying they're going to respond. There's been reports that say Iran is going to launch an attack from Iraq, coordinated with the Shia militias that are part of Iraq's, official security forces. And of course, there's the risk here. The U.S. is vowing to defend Israel from any potential Iranian attack. So there's the risk that the U.S. military assets in the region will come under attack. If Iran calculates that their attack on Israel is going to provoke something big, then they might try to hit some U.S. targets to get ahead of it. And if the Shia militias are involved, they've been targeting U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria. So for the background here, from October 2023 until February of this year, U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria came under hundreds of rocket and drone attacks due to U.S. support for Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza. After 3 U.S. troops were killed at Tower 22, which is a secretive U.S. base in Jordan right on the Syrian border, this culminated in 3 U.S. troops being killed. Iran and the Iraqi government pressured the militias who were launching these attacks to stop, and the attacks have been less frequent since then. But they still happen occasionally, and there were some U.S. troops recently wounded, I believe back in August in Iraq. So since October 2023, President Biden has ordered multiple rounds of airstrikes against these Iraqi Shia militias who are part of the Popular Mobilization Forces, which again is part of Iraq's military. So the U.S. has bombed them and killed dozens of them over the past year in separate, multiple airstrikes. And Iraq has not been happy about that. They've called for the U.S. to leave. The U.S. negotiated a deal that will end the mission of the U.S.-led coalition in Iraq, but the U.S. is still going to be able to keep troops in the country. It's just completely ridiculous to keep troops in Iraq and Syria. It's just a tripwire for war. They're completely in harm's way. Again, if things really escalate with Iran, they can get hit really hard by Iranian missiles and we could see big American casualties. So it's always a risk, and now these airstrikes could just lead to more escalations from these Shia militias and potentially from Iran, while they're planning their attack on Israel. So just not good. Again, just so foolish to keep these troops here. They got to get out. But this is definitely an area to keep an eye on over the next few months or during this transition period. All right, so the next one here. And another thing, this happens as Israel has really ramped up its airstrikes on Syria that Jason's been covering for us. So the next story here, Israeli drone attack targets aid distribution center in Syria. This one is from Jason Ditz. The near daily Israeli airstrikes on unrelated targets in Syria continued today. This was on Monday when a multi-rocket drone strike hit a distribution center for humanitarian aid in the village of Shin Shar on the highway between Homs and Damascus. Reports are that the rockets were fired at a convoy of trucks headed to the site. This also led to initial reports that the target was a military site linked to Iran. And while that does not appear to be the case, pro-Israeli social media still insists that the truck are somehow in league with Iran and or Hezbollah. Shin Shar is a relatively small Sunni village, so it wouldn't make sense for Shiite Hezbollah to set up a military site there. So they're saying that this was an attack on humanitarian aid trucks. And a lot of people from Lebanon have fled into Syria, have fled the Israeli bombardment, gone into Syria. And of course, places in Lebanon where Israel has not ordered evacuations, they're bombing them. They've bombed the road from Lebanon to Syria, so it just seems like nowhere is safe. Very similar to Gaza. All right, so the next one here, Israel is building along the UN-patrolled demilitarized zone in Syria. So this article is from AP. Israel has begun a construction project along the so-called Alpha Line that separates the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights from Syria, apparently laying asphalt for a road right along the frontier, satellite photos analyzed by the Associated Press show. Israeli troops have entered the demilitarized zone during the work, the United Nations confirms to AP, a violation of the ceasefire rules governing the area. The work, which earlier satellite photos show began in earnest in late September, follows the completion by the Israeli military of new roadways and what appears to be a buffer zone along the Gaza Strip's frontier with Israel. The Israeli military has begun demolishing villages in Lebanon where United Nations peacekeepers have come under fire. So far, there has been no major violence along the Alpha Line. Again, this is the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights that Israel annexed from Syria. The only country in the world that recognizes it is the U.S. That's a thing that Trump did. And this delineates the demilitarized zone between Syria and the Israeli-occupied territory, and UN peacekeepers have patrolled this area since 1974. Syria, which has been at war with Israel since its founding in 1948 and relies on Iran for support, has remained silent regarding the construction, but the Golan Heights remains a flashpoint. And again, so this comes with the backdrop of Israel really ramping up its airstrikes on Syria. I mean, they've been bombing Syria for years now, and they've really ramped it up since October 7th, and then just recently escalated things even more. So this is just something, again, we see this activity in Gaza where they're building things inside the Gaza's territory, creating these buffer zones. It looks like they're eyeing something like that in Lebanon now, and this could be part of Israel's plans for expansion in the region. All right, so the next one here, Trump picks Mike Waltz as national security advisor. So not the best news here. President-elect Donald Trump has asked Mike Waltz, a hawkish House Republican from Florida, to be his national security advisor in the incoming administration, multiple media outlets reported on Monday night. Waltz was a staunch supporter of the Ukraine proxy war early on, and he was one of the few members of Congress to actually suggest that the U.S. should send military advisors into the country. I wrote up a story about that. This is back in July 2022, and he was part of this House delegation that went over to Kiev, and they came back, and he said, let's send military advisors to help with intelligence and logistics. So that's he was very gung-ho about the proxy war. And he was also critical of President Biden for supposedly not being aggressive enough. I linked to an article there from Michael Tracy from back in 2022. He interviewed him along with a few other Republicans, Ukraine supporters. In 2023, Waltz began to express skepticism of the war, saying that the U.S. involvement in the conflict was not sustainable. However, in an interview with NPR just last week, Waltz suggested that he would advise the president to end the war in Ukraine by escalating. So when explaining how he thinks Trump could bring both sides to the table, Waltz said that the U.S. could ramp up sanctions enforcement on Russia and support Ukraine using NATO-provided long-range missiles for strikes inside Russia. And as we've been covering, Putin has made clear that would risk nuclear war. He altered Russia's nuclear doctrine or ordered the changes to it in response to that. So this is what Waltz said to NPR just last week. This is very recent. He said, quote, "First and foremost, you would enforce the actual energy sanctions on Russia. Russia is essentially a gas station with nukes. Putin is selling more oil and gas now than he did pre-war through China and Russia. And you couple that with unleashing our energy, lifting our LNG ban, and his economy and his war machine will dry up very quickly." End quote. So just saying, a little more sanctions and that's it. Russia's done. I mean, that's not a realistic way to view this. Then he went on and said, quote, "So I think that will get Putin to the table. We have leverage, like taking the handcuffs off of the long-range weapons we provided Ukraine as well. And then, of course, I think we have plenty of leverage with Zelensky to get them to the table." End quote. So that doesn't sound good. And then discussing Iran, Waltz said that the U.S. must go back to the maximum pressure campaign, referring to the previous Trump administration's Iran policies, which involved pulling out of the nuclear deal, the crippling sanctions, and assassinating Soleimani. So he's very hawkish on Iran. He's also a staunch supporter of Israel and has repeated Trump's calls to allow Israel to finish the job in Gaza. In a piece that he wrote for The Economist recently, he wrote, quote, "The next administration should, as Mr. Trump argued, let Israel finish the job and get it over with fast against Hamas. They should put a credible military option on the table to make clear to the Iranians that America would stop them building nuclear weapons." End quote. And he argued in this Economist essay that the U.S. is too bogged down in the Middle East and Ukraine. The message was that the U.S. should be more focused on China. And he is known as one of the biggest China hawks in Congress. He declared back in 2021 that the U.S. is in a new Cold War with China. He frequently calls for the U.S. to send more weapons to Taiwan, saying last year that the U.S. should arm the island to the teeth. And the Pentagon, when we talk about the future, it's tough to, I try to cover this stuff with China and Taiwan. I want to cover it more often. There's just so much going on with Ukraine and the Middle East. But that's the big war that the U.S. military says that it's preparing for. The head of U.S. Strategic Command recently said, this might have been last year that he said this, which is the U.S. military officer in charge of the U.S. nuclear stockpile. He said, the big one is coming. What we're seeing in Ukraine right now is nothing. The big one is next. And he was referring to a war with China, and they're planning for a direct war with China, despite the risk of nuclear war. So China hawks, some of them might sound more reasonable. They'll say, we should wind down things in Ukraine, de-escalate in the Middle East, and focus on China. But they want to commit to going to war with China if it attacks Taiwan. And these policies of flooding Taiwan with weapons and increasing military and diplomatic support for Taiwan is making war more likely. And that's very clear just by looking at the last few years, looking at China's response to the U.S. increasing the support. So China hawks are not good to have around either. Unfortunately, realistically, there's not many options for these positions that aren't hawks, in some way, but Waltz seems pretty bad all around here. All right, the next one here, and this is more bad news on this front. Trump is expected to name Marco Rubio as the Secretary of State. So this was published by the New York Times on Monday night. It says President-elect Donald J. Trump is expected to name Senator Marco Rubio of Florida as his Secretary of State. 3 people familiar with his thinking said on Monday, as Mr. Trump moves rapidly to fill out his foreign policy and national security team. Mr. Trump could still change his mind at the last minute, the people said, but appeared to have settled on Mr. Rubio, whom he also considered when choosing his running mate this year. Mr. Rubio was elected to the Senate in 2010 and has staked out a position as a foreign policy hawk, taking hard lines on China and Iran in particular. He's very hawkish. I mean, he's essentially a neocon. And, recently I've heard him say some things like, oh, we should, we have to bring the war in Ukraine to a conclusion. That sort of rhetoric has been more common among even really hawkish Republicans. But overall, I mean, Rubio is about as bad as you can get. So not a good sign here. And the next one, more bad news related to Trump filling out his administration. Trump nominates Representative Elise Stefanik as ambassador to the UN. So President-elect Donald Trump confirmed on Monday that he has nominated Representative Elise Stefanik, Republican from New York, to be his ambassador to the United Nations, a pick that is a victory for hawks. Stefanik is a staunch Israel supporter. I've used that word quite a lot, staunch. And she's an Iran hawk who has said there should be no conditions on U.S. military aid to Israel. Earlier this year, she took a little trip over to Israel, spoke to the Knesset, and went after Biden for delaying one 2,000-pound bomb shipment. She said, quote, "There is no excuse for an American president to block aid to Israel," end quote. And she said that before, saying, no conditions, give them whatever they want. And Stefanik, she really led the charge against college students protesting against U.S. support for Israel, smearing them as anti-Semitic for opposing Israel's onslaught in Gaza, even though many demonstrators were Jewish themselves. Jewish Voice for Peace and other Jewish groups led a lot of these protests. They had Passover Seders at these Gaza encampments at the college, but they were all raging anti-Semites, apparently. Stefanik told the Israeli Knesset, quote, "I led the charge to expose this moral rot of anti-Semitism infecting our supposed most elite higher education institutions," end quote. She's the one, there was this viral clip of her asking these heads of these universities, is calling for the genocide of the Jews. Does that violate policies? And they were saying like, oh, it depends on the context. The context that was missing from that clip that went around is right before that, Stefanik established that she considered, these protest slogans like "from the river to the sea" and globalize the intifada or whatever. She said, oh, those are calls for genocide. So when you establish that, which is just completely ridiculous. So it's just this total all this hysteria about this anti-Semitism. She's really led this, and these people want to crack down on the speech of people who oppose U.S. support for Israel, and that's us. So it's not a good sign to see people like this being elevated. And Trump himself, he said some horrific things at some of his campaign events at these Israel organizations, talking about deporting, protesters and things like that. So this just is not a good sign. And she's called the UN anti-Semitic, like the Israeli officials. I saw Max Blumenthal, when this first came out, he tweeted something like, oh, Trump has, rewarded Israel by giving them another ambassador at the UN. And that's essentially what this is. She essentially will serve as another Israeli ambassador to the UN as the American ambassador. Also, she was first elected to Congress in 2014. And before that, she worked for hawkish think tanks, including the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and the Foreign Policy Initiative, which was founded by neoconservatives Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan. And when we talk about neocons, they're about as neocon as you get, Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan. All right, so the next one here, Israel. So we're going to get into Gaza now. Israel kills at least 37 Palestinians in Gaza. So Israeli attacks on Gaza killed at least 37 Palestinians on Monday, Palestinian medics told Reuters, as Israeli strikes continued across the Strip. The majority of those reported killed were in central Gaza's Nuseirat refugee camp. Israeli tanks entered the western side of the refugee camp, and health officials at the Al-Awda hospital in Nuseirat said 20 people were killed in a series of ground and air attacks, including one that hit a tent camp. Residents of Nuseirat told Reuters that the Israeli attack completely took them by surprise. See some of the aftermath of the Israeli assault there in this picture. In southern Gaza, an Israeli strike hit a cafe west of the city of Khan Yunis, killing 7. In the north, Israeli strikes continued in the city of Bet Lahia, which has been under a total Israeli siege as part of this ethnic cleansing campaign that's happening in northern Gaza. Israeli strikes again targeted the Kamal Adwan hospital in Bet Lahia, which has just come under a repeated attack. It injured 3 medical workers. Palestinian medics said that attacks elsewhere in the city killed at least 4 people. Gaza's health ministry, they did not put out their daily death toll update. It seems like they've been putting it out less frequently. Could just be the breakdown of communications and everything, and the situation on the ground there in Gaza. So the slaughter continues every day, dozens and dozens of Palestinians being killed with U.S. bombs that are being dropped by Israel. All right, so the next one here, the Israeli army allows systematic looting of Gaza aid shipments. This article is from the Cradle. So the Israeli army has been permitting the looting of humanitarian aid trucks by desperate gunmen and gangs upon their entry into the Gaza Strip. This was reported by Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, on November 11th. The gunmen have been blocking roads through which trucks enter the Strip via the Kerem Shalom border crossing, according to the report. The area is under the complete control of Israeli forces who turn a blind eye, the report adds. So the report said, quote, since some of the aid groups refuse to pay protection money, the aid often ends up sitting in warehouses that are under Israeli army control. The armed attacks take place just a few hundred meters away from Israeli troops. Some aid groups say attacked truck drivers have even sought help from the IDF, but the army has refused to intervene. Moreover, they say the army bars them from taking alternate roads that are considered safer. End quote. A senior aid official said, quote, I tried everything we wanted to travel through other roads, but the IDF forbade us, end quote. So the report cites army sources as saying that in the past, troops have attacked the looters, but aid workers got injured in the process. The army has referred to the area as the looting zone. The report says, quote, the looting of the convoys reflects the complete anarchy that prevails in Gaza due to the lack of any functioning civilian government. In several cases, they add that the last remnants of the local police forces tried to take action against the looters, but they are attacked by Israeli troops who view them as part of Hamas, end quote. That's one thing Israel did. They completely decimated the police force. They killed all the cops. And you would see, there was reports of Israel attacking, bombing aid trucks. And I remember one case where they said, we saw an armed man on the truck. And, that's security for the truck. But they use that to justify bombing the truck. And then now, they kill all the police who were guarding the trucks, but they just let the looters loot the aid. And that's that. So it's just another thing really impeding the relief, any kind of relief for the Palestinians in Gaza. All right, so the next one here, Smotrich says that Trump is an opportunity to annex the West Bank. So Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich said Monday that Donald Trump's victory in the U.S. presidential election provides an important opportunity for Israel to annex settlements in the occupied West Bank. Smotrich said, quote, the year 2025 will be, with God's help, the year of sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, end quote. And he's using the biblical name there for the West Bank. He went on saying that he had, quote, no doubt that President Trump, who showed courage and determination in his decisions in the first term, will support the state of Israel in this move, end quote. Smotrich listed steps that Trump took to support Israel during his first term in office, including moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights, and declaring that illegal Israeli settlements were consistent with international law. Smotrich is a settler himself. He also holds a position in the defense ministry that puts him in charge of settlement expansion in the West Bank. And in that post, Smotrich has overseen significant settlement expansion and the single largest Israeli land grab in the West Bank in 30 years. So Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, these guys are excited about Trump coming back in. And, if David Friedman, who is Trump's ambassador to Israel, if he gets put back in, that's going to be a sign that Trump is going to give these guys what they want. Friedman just recently published a book calling for not only for the U.S. to support Israel's annexation of the West Bank, he said that the U.S. should fund Israel's annexation to the West Bank to the tune of $1 billion. So not a good sign that these guys are happy and excited and thinking that the U.S. is going to support this. And we saw the violence is still very bad in the West Bank. We saw, a couple months ago, very big Israeli raids where they were destroying the roads, destroying the infrastructure in these major cities in the West Bank. And that, we might see more of that as they want to, they want to push Palestinians out of their homes. All right, so the next one here, Netanyahu aides suspected of blackmail to alter October 7th records. This article is from the Times of Israel. And it's a crazy story. So top aides to Benjamin Netanyahu are suspected of trying to blackmail an IDF officer in the military secretariat of the prime minister's office in order to modify minutes of top-level security discussions in the hours before the Hamas attack that sparked the war in Gaza, Hebrew media reported on Friday. So this is saying that top aides of Netanyahu tried to blackmail an IDF officer to change the minutes, the recording, the official record of the conversations that they had before the Hamas attack on southern Israel on October 7th. And we've seen all these reports, all these reasons why Israel should have known something was coming. There's one part of this that I want to make sure I read. Here we go. According to Channel 12, as part of the alleged attempt to change protocols, Netanyahu's aides are thought to have used sensitive footage of a military secretariat officer in order to coax him into changing protocols discussions from the night of October 6th to the 7th, 2023, hours before the Hamas attack. Netanyahu has blamed Israel's security forces for failure to foresee the attack and resisted calls for a public commission of inquiry to be established into the events leading up to it. Channel 13 said Netanyahu's aides allegedly stole compromising information about a military secretariat officer from the phone of a woman who works in the prime minister's office. Netanyahu's aides allegedly took her phone under the pretext that she was suspected of leaking confidential information, but are thought to have sought her personal correspondence with the officer, the report said. So seems like there's something there. All right, so the next one here. Israel attacks North Lebanon village, 14 killed. This is another one from Jason Ditz. So on Monday, Israel carried out its northernmost attack on Lebanese soil during its current war, hitting a shelter for refugees in the far north village of Ain Yaqub. The building housed mostly Syrian refugees, according to local officials. At least 14 people were killed in the attack and over 15 wounded, according to the mayor. The overall toll is likely to rise as rescuers still comb the rubble for survivors. Lebanese media has already reported the casualties to be in excess of 30, which is the number of people the shelter is said to have housed. So Ain Yaqub is in the Akkar province, the furthest north province of Lebanon. The village is majority Sunni Muslims and Greek Orthodox Christians. Locals said there is no visible Hezbollah presence, so it is unclear why the shelter was targeted by Israel. And it doesn't look like there was any comment from Israel on this attack. All right, so the last one here. Kremlin denies report of a Trump-Putin phone call. So I covered this yesterday that the Washington Post reported that Trump spoke with Putin last week, warned him not to escalate in Ukraine. The Kremlin denied the report, calling it pure fiction. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, quote, "There was no conversation. This is completely untrue. It's pure fiction," end quote. He said that the report was, quote, the most remarkable example of the quality of information that is published nowadays, sometimes even by quite respected outlets, end quote. And then a spokesman for Trump was asked about the report and said, that they have no comment on private calls between President Trump and other world leaders. So kind of strange. The Post reported this, had all these details. Russia says it never happened. Trump's people are not commenting on it. And another thing, Ukraine, the Post report said that the Ukrainians were informed of the call ahead of time, and they denied that as well. So who knows what really happened here. I know that they say that Trump is making his calls not using the State Department, because usually during the transition team, the State Department will help the president-elect making calls. But during the last transition, transcripts were leaked and everything during that time. So the Trump team, apparently, this was according to the Washington Post report, so who knows. But they're saying that they're not doing that for fear of their conversations being leaked. So this could be why they're just not commenting on the conversations at all. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints. One from Tina Antonis. What's really going on in the South China Sea between the Philippines and China? One from Kyle Anzalone, the man who can help Trump bring peace to Korea. That is about a suggestion for potential envoy to North Korea, Joseph Terwilliger, who is actually, he's been to North Korea before. He served as Dennis Rodman's interpreter. He's actually spoken with Kim Jong-un. He knows him, and he would be a great envoy to work for Korean peace. So definitely go check that out and read about him. One from Chris McCallion, Domino Theory refuses to fall. And one from Brandon P. Buck, America was never isolationist. And our spotlight is from Daniel Larison, Stefanik UN pick, win for hardliners aiming to front-load Trump White House. So please go check all of that out. Lots of stuff going on. We're trying to cover the transition stuff that's important to foreign policy, and there's just all this violence in the Middle East that, Israel and the U.S. are involved in. So just so much going on. But that is it. You could always support this show by sharing it. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. Like, subscribe, comment. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.